Many retail AI pilots set high expectations, then collapse under the weight of scale, costing businesses and shaking executive confidence. In this episode of the Commerce Cast, we explore why so many projects fall into the scaling trap, contrasted to the approach of the few that succeed. I'm joined by Yasen Dimitrov, co-founder and chief analytics officer at Intelligence Node. Yasen explains how deterministic retail problems break probabilistic AI tools, why SKU level intelligence is the gold standard for scaling, and why the future of retail AI depends less on bigger models and more on leaner teams and smarter incentives. So Yasen, you have a really interesting career background in analytics. Do you just want to give us a brief overview?
Sure. I started my career back in 2005 in London as a FX research analyst. And I know that sounds strange, but you go out of university, you don't know what to do, and you answer the first ad on LinkedIn or whatever was the platform at that point in time. And actually, quite funnily enough, in that particular consultancy, I met Sanjeev as well. After that short stint in the foreign exchange analytics world, I moved to Expand Research, that was more high-level consultancy that was actually bought by BCG at a late stage, where I was exposed to more strategic projects and moved away from ultimately day-to-day coding and analytics. So during that process, we kept talking with Sanjeev, and in 2014, our paths crossed again, and we started Intelligence Node.
Amazing. So you'll see probably in our discussion today how your career in finance really parallels into some of the applications with high frequency data in the retail vertical, which is probably fair to say is a lagging or behind some of the technologies and capabilities in finance. So let's dive right in. Yasen, you've said that the story is that AI isn't failing, and this is in reference to a recent MIT report that came out and said, I think specifically in relation to generative AI, that 95% of AI deployments were failing. And it's not the technology itself, it's the companies and the approach. So they're trying to solve deterministic retail problems with probabilistic tools. So can you unpack what that means for us in a little bit more depth and clarity?
Sure. So I think that there are two kind of sides of the story here. So first of all, I think folks are focusing really on the 95%, but not on the 5%. So what's happening is that there are companies that are succeeding, and we should keep a really good look at those companies, because if this particular gap doesn't expand, then those companies will become the winners of the future. So that's on one side. On the other side, we have the 95% that, to be quite frank, don't know what they're doing. And the reason being is, at the moment, we have great models that are released. You have Anthropic, you have OpenAI, and you have a lot of open source models. But there's still a lot of limitations, primarily scale limitations and accuracy limitation, or in other words, called hallucination. So why the projects are failing? The projects are failing because folks are trying to implement the whole workflow via LLMs. So what that means is they take a whole process and they apply a ChatGPT or Anthropic or any of those and expect that process to actually be successful. And that's never going to be the case for a variety of different reasons. The main one being these companies have built very robust processes over the last 10, 20, 30 years. And those processes are very step dependent and they're very specific, right? And they're specifically built for scale. So what that means is when you put a suboptimal production level model, these processes will fail. So what we've done as Intelligence Node is we've actually applied a differential tactic, meaning we've applied LLMs to certain steps in our processes and actually left the scalable solution still to be run by the deterministic system. So what I mean by that again is, for example, scraping. What we've done there is we've applied a lot of AI workloads to creating the regular expression. However, when we're talking about scraping billions, literally billions of product every day, we can't do that with the probabilistic model. We still need the deterministic model that actually go and execute. So we've combined both deterministic and probabilistic to make sure that the accuracy is there, first of all, and second of all, most importantly, the scale is there.
Absolutely. So there's this term, the scaling trap, as it relates specifically to product retail. Can you just unpack again what would happen, say, when an AI system jumps from 100 to 100,000 stock keeping units or items? Because it's very easy for somebody to present a really compelling demo at the micro scale. But what happens when that has to jump up to 100,000 SKUs?
So, to be quite honest, at the moment, nothing will happen because OpenAI will not allow it. You hit your rates limits and your production system will stall because you just don't have enough credits. So that's purely probabilistic problem where unfortunately the models are not performing to perfection as of yet. So you have some accuracy errors for sure as well.
One other term that's often thrown around in businesses in enterprise is the ultimate source of truth or the one model to rule them all. This seems oversimplified and leans into the tendency we can have as humans to look for a silver bullet. Can you explain why this is so dangerous?
I think considering the nature of retail or considering the nature of all the industries, you still have a lot of domain knowledge that needs to be instilled in those systems. So what we've discovered the hard way is that once you give several steps or once you allow several agents to interact between each other, errors occur. So those models are really good when you actually have a simple process and simple interaction. However, once there is a more complex concept or more complex interaction, then you have discrepancies. So that happens even within a domain, in our case, retail. Once you introduce different concepts, for example, you overlay finance to it, you overlay medicine, then the interaction between those models become really complicated. And you can see how easily you can have cross-functional confusion between the different agents.
So, what you're saying is the contextual knowledge and the sort of vertical specific application to retail or even to a specific category in retail, that knowledge and context becomes much more important. And it can be challenging for the models to have evolved to the point of being able to comprehend all of that context at this point in time.
Absolutely. We see it even now. We see it even now when we ask. So let's say, for example, when we query a certain model and then you have a more complicated, let's say, 3-question prompt, the model performs significantly worse than if you have 3 different agents that are asking 3 different questions versus asking a more complicated prompt with three questions. Because again, the context matter and the agent can be easily confused.
Got it. So something else you've said, Yasen, is that the bottleneck has shifted as it relates to data science teams. So the scarce resource is no longer PhD data scientists building proprietary models, but engineers and ML ops teams who can deploy and scale open models that we've been talking about. And so what does that shift mean specifically for retail organizations?
It's extremely important how we approach the data science organization today. So I recently spoke to, in an offsite, to a very large analytics company, and their data science team is around 300 to 400 people, depending on what you consider data science. That's an incredibly large team that, in my mind, or in my assessment, not required today. So why is that? So you have several reasons. First of all, if we look at specifically on multimodal transformers, multimodal transformers are an incredibly powerful tool that solves a lot of use cases in retail. So, for example, ChatGPT 4.0 and up, that's a multimodal transformer. Ultimately, what it means is that actually it has multimodality as an input. So you can add picture, you can add video, you can add text, and those work together to create a unified output. So what was happening over the last several years is that all those multimodal transformers were released as closed sourced. So all the powerful models were actually closed source, meaning the organizations that were looking at those had a very good excuse not to use them. The common excuse was, but they're closed source. The company on the other side controls the price, so we're going to deploy them in production and they're going to jack up the price, for example. That's a common excuse. Or another favorite excuse of mine is they're closed source, we cannot optimize, which again is completely irrelevant considering the talent that works in those models and those companies and how they operationalize those models. So I think a very important excuse that actually it's not relevant at the moment. So you had OpenAI and XAI actually committing to release the next or the previous version of their model as open source. So that's not an excuse. So what was happening before was traditionally what data science teams have done is that they have a task, they have a team on that task, and this team tests, let's say, 7, 8, 9, 10 different traditional learning models. For example, they have a task to extract a hat from an image, to categorize a certain product as a hat, right? So they will try certain regressions. Then they'll go to support vector machines. Then they'll go to neural nets. Then they'll try something else. And then it's an iterative method that at some point yields a certain percentage of success. So let's say based on a certain model combination, they've achieved 73%. If you look at all the papers that have been published over the last several years, you have those incremental approaches that are still traditional machine learning based, meaning folks are just trying to tweak a particular model or particular approach and make it slightly better. So they go from 76 to 79 and everybody's clapping, which I think is ridiculous. What I foresee happening is that more and more teams will start deploying those multimodal systems that are actually significantly better and are much more optimized. And what's more important, they do not require that many people to run. So what you will have is significant improvement in the solve percentage for retail use cases. You have significant decrease in data science teams, and that will create a complete disruption in the system. So now what becomes really useful is to be able to know how to work with agents. You need to be able to know how to integrate the system, hence the ML ops role, and you need to know how to orchestrate the system. Suddenly, 10 years experience in MATLAB or 10 years experience in particular neural net development becomes completely irrelevant.
And would it be fair to say that this changes the landscape as well in relation to competitive moats? So no longer do you perhaps need to be the big enterprise who can deploy a lot of resource to hiring and support in data science. You can be, as we see happening, more of a upstart brand or retailer who has access to building these systems at far lower costs. So it's scary for enterprise if they can't shift these approaches that they've been relying on for perhaps the last 10, 20 years or longer.
Yeah, I think what will be the end result is that I'm not forecasting the doom and gloom of, let's say, traditional SaaS companies that service retail by any means, but they will for sure have problems with growth. And if they have problems with growth, the only way to actually to grow bottom line is to look at their expenses. How to do that? Coming back to my previous point, reduce data science teams and implement multimodal transformers and all the like systems that are appearing at the moment. I still think the moat will be there. And the reason the moat will be there, again, coming back to my initial point, these systems, these companies have developed scalable solutions that are very difficult to replicate in production. The system might be simple, but make it scalable is extremely difficult. So I don't see a particular kind of mode disruption there, at least for the next 5 to 10 years. But again, we don't know, considering the rate of innovation, we don't know what will be the technology that's available to all the startups 5 years from now. But I think for the now, I would say the modes still exist, but I wouldn't be the one that's jumping on and investing in their shares.
Sure. There's certainly a lot of uncertainty to navigate. So in retail, we have the tasks like SKU normalization, shelf image analysis, product description generation. So these are all high volume multimodal jobs. Why is retail uniquely positioned potentially to feel the impact of this disruption or open multimodal models? That's a mouthful. First, perhaps relative to other industries, or is there not much difference there? Is this disruption just equally going to be felt across other industries as well?
I think that's a great question. I think that it can be looked at from two angles. So the first angle is retail is extremely well positioned to be online, right? To have a large part of its workflow to be available in an electronic way. And that's why we've seen the e-commerce growth over the last 10 years or so. So you have the backbone, you already have the basis, the framework for you to actually use those models. The majority of the workflow is already online. And what's happening on the back of that is that you have two main things that are happening to retail that are actually making the adoption of LLMs and AI for that matter critical. So the first one is the increased modality of the SKU. And I'll come to what that means. And the second one is the need to action quickly. By increased modality, we mean the way a particular product is represented. Now you can have a video, you can have an image, you can have a dynamic text, you have reviews, you have different representation of a product based on different searches. So all those things are different modalities that the SKU can actually live in. And then obviously you have the fast moving aspect of the shelf and pricing. So for that, we need agents, in this particular case, AI agents, that will be able to react to the market quickly. So what I mean by that is if there is a market event, for example, price drops, or a particular product becomes popular for X, Y, Z reason, then you have a lot of moving bits and pieces, you as a competitor or you as a company, that needs to happen for you to actually react to that change. So the only way for you to do that is via some kind of a AI workflow using AI agents. So the combination of both, the framework is already there, and then the consumer demands the fast nature and the variety of retail combines the need for LLMs and AI integration in particular.
Do you see a lot of parallels between this evolution in how pricing, product descriptions are more dynamically set in a marketplace in a digital context? Do you see parallels there to some of the things you observed during your time working in finance? Because I know a foundational thesis for Intelligence Node was this idea of the Bloomberg terminal, where prices, market movements, these are outward in, and retail has traditionally been inside out. I set my product categories, I design, manufacture my products, I design my pricing. Maybe I take in some analytics related to that, but then I push it into the market. That's the legacy approach. So in a way, everything is flipped on its head. So I'd just be interested to understand from your perspective some of those parallels in relation to that Bloomberg terminal analogy.
So I think there is definitely parallel. Unfortunately, we were too early to realize this, but now we can see a lot of dynamism in the marketplace, in particular in relation to pricing and availability, where brands and retailers are playing with different techniques on how to extract value out of certain regions or certain times of the day or certain events that are happening during the day. So it is 100% there, and it is impacting how the consumer actually shops as well. But the only way for brands to react to this change that's happening is they need some kind of a system that helps them do that.
Can you talk a little bit about what Intelligence Node has been involved with in terms of the agentic systems for commerce with IPG?
Sure. So coming back to all the points that I mentioned, what is the current situation on the ground is that you have small brands that are very agile. They can change their content quite quickly. They can adjust to competitive pressure quite quickly, and they can actually be very nimble in how they approach retail media. So you have that on one side, and then you have traditional brands that take, in some cases, months to change their name on Amazon or, for that matter, on any of the marketplaces. So that's the current situation. And just to add, those traditional brands are sporadically spending a large sums of money to retail media, but I think they're reaching a limit where the ROI is just not there. So in Intelligence Node, obviously with our partners in IPG Commerce, we've been working on different solutions to actually bridge that gaps for manufacturers. So we're building solutions and agentic systems that helps traditional brands to be more agile and help them productionalize changes across a wide variety of retailers.
Makes sense. So this is something that systems that can be deployed to basically work through decisions, whether it relates to product naming or pricing, for example, in a much more automated way for perhaps the 80% of long tail products that are not mission critical, generating the most revenue and profit for the business. So you can hand that to the machine to compete more effectively in the
That's right.
marketplace. Is that a fair kind of summary?
In some cases, to make it even more dramatic, in some cases, these traditional manufacturers have large teams sitting somewhere out of Philippines or India or Vietnam that look at competitive changes and actually they do those changes manually very sporadically. Or they have very long approval processes to change a particular SKU name or description. So all these kind of processes require automation and require further analysis to make sure that they're optimized. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to bring those brands to the marketplace rather than just allowing them to spend large amount of money on retail media.
Absolutely. And the challenge is, I think, with a lot of large retail enterprises, the way that they've been set up is through a lot of different organizational silos and units. So you have e-commerce over here, you have marketing, you have pricing and merchandising in another team. And this orchestration really requires, I think, in many ways, like a cross functional approach or a merging of these different separate silos, which is another challenge. So, if you're a retail CMO, CIO, or chief data officer, what would you be asking your teams right now to make sure that you're keeping pace with these changes and also not stuck in this old excuses era, as we talked about previously?
So if you're a CMO, for example, I would definitely be asking our team to make sure that, first of all, we understand what is the process of change for our organization and the process of changing our modality online. And again, if I double click on that, is what do I need to make sure that the products that I have online are best positioned and able to change at pretty much a consumer request. And that in many cases will involve legal, compliance, pricing, strategy. So all those teams need to work in sync to make sure that a single product name is changed. So first of all, we need to make sure that those processes are redefined and changed to ensure that when a recommendation is provided, is actually actioned at the right time.
It makes sense. And in a large enterprise, it's often easier said than done, as we've
It's extremely
experienced. But
challenging.
yeah, yeah.
There are traditional teams, such as legal and compliance, for example, that have exercised a lot of power over the years, and it's very difficult to change the culture and to let go.
Yeah, there's certainly a focus on control and a real need for, I think, more cohesion in this landscape. You've said this isn't the end of data science, but the end of excuses. Can you just tell us how you see data science teams reshaping themselves over the next 3 to 5 years?
So I would see a significantly lower headcount. I don't want to be dramatic here, but I won't be surprised if the team gets cut by 60, 70%, and actually they increase their productivity due to the tools that are available around. So I would be extremely worried if HR folks are listening to us. I think they have to be very careful how they approach the data science hiring in their organization. Because coming back to the point that I made earlier, at the moment, a 10-year experienced data scientist with significant MATLAB know-how is becoming, I wouldn't say irrelevant, but a lot less valuable to an organization than 6 months ago.
And I suppose on the side of benefits to the organization, you're really getting the chance to build smaller, leaner teams that are much closer to the business impact. So that's subject matter knowledge and the end impact to consumer and supply chain and all of the activities the business are involved in become much closer to that person working in a smaller data science team, I would think.
Yeah, I think now I can think of a parallel from finance. So in large multinational banks, you have a position called quantitative traders. So this is a position where a quantitatively based person with a significant knowledge in physics and modeling will sit with a trader to execute trades. And in some of the cases, they will be running their own book. So I would expect a similar kind of a role or a similar kind of position of the data science units going forward. So
would you see that as the new merchant, like the new age sort of merchant for retail?
I wouldn't go that far, but I think that the data science role per se will evolve to more of a business leading role rather than a back office role. And even though the size of the team will reduce, you have the importance of the team that will increase dramatically.
Got it. Thank you, Yasin. This has been a really insightful conversation. Is there anything else you'd like to share or any closing remarks?
So, not really, but I would like to take a step back. And we all, as a team, we need to think about how all those changes are impacting what we are delivering to clients and how we are going about working for clients. When we started the company with Sanjeev, our key mistake, I would say, was to position Intelligence Node as an innovative company rather than as a solution provider. And that's my advice, I guess, to companies that similar to us is please do not position yourself as an innovation providers. That's not what's gonna get you the business. Position yourself as a solution provider that actually leverages everything that's out there. I think that's a very important point, rather than trying to be a new Google, which I don't think is gonna work.
So you're saying a solution provider that leverages the existing capabilities that exist and is able to bring those to get together quickly and deploy them, like new models, for example, in the context toward a vertical specific problem, like the ones that we experience in retail.
Yes, I think that there is no shame in admitting that particular tasks can be solved better from something that's developed by OpenAI, for example, versus us spending incredible amount of time on subpar solutions that will only get us 30% there. I think having the gut to admit yourself and to your client, I think will get you a lot more in the new era of analytics and retail.
So I think that's a really important point because I just want to highlight something that I observe a lot is that tendency to want to control, especially want to control information, competitive intelligence, etc. So companies trying to build their own internal versions of ChatGPT like models for their staff to use, for example. So they're not typing things into just what a publicly available system. But as you say, that just detracts energy from other areas into building things that already exist that are going to be subpar to those other models that already exist. Do you have any comments to make on that dynamic? Because I feel like it's pretty common to see that happening in large organizations.
I think it's an extremely important point. And I get why large organizations will want to do something by themselves, but I think you need to find a balance there. If you are, for example, Walmart, you would like to use the most kind of recent version of ChatGPT for certain tasks, but you will ban ChatGPT from other tasks. My point being here is that considering that what XAI and ChatGPT have done over the last, or OpenAI for that matter, have done over the last several weeks, where they've said we're going to release our models open source, then I think it's extremely important, at least for the experimentation teams in those organizations, to be using the most recent version of the model to make sure that they're the cutting edge of development, right? Considering that excuse is already gone. So the excuse of the model will be closed forever, that excuse is gone. So it's extremely important for those folks to be at the cutting edge, not only Walmart, Intelligence Note as well, right? Companies from our size to the size of Walmart. And if they don't do that, they can be very easily disrupted.
That makes sense. So there's no excuses, but there's probably an additional level of sensitivity that maybe needs to reduce somewhat in relation to information security and putting information into these systems because at the end of the day, you can invest just so much energy in protection and being protectionist versus being open and having more energy going into innovation. And that's where you see people winning and new entrepreneurs coming into new spaces really quickly and disrupting.
I think you can add one thing to the previous comment, which is, I think, important. I was part of a workshop last week, and the number of questions I got on security and compliance was just incredible. People were not concerned about what the models will do, they were concerned how the models will give out my data, which I think is a relevant concern. However, I think the biggest mistakes that folks do when they think about security is they compare AI or anything else to perfection. They do not compare it to human. Human are imperfect. And in most of the cases, those systems will perform much better than a human. So we have to be very cautious about how we actually benchmark compliance for those systems, right? We need to compare them against human performance, not against perfection. Perfection is always preferred, but you cannot productionalize a system with perfection in a quick and an agile way.
That's right. We can only get closer and closer to perfection by using the best available solutions.
That's right.
Thank you. Thank you, Yasen. This discussion has been wonderful, and we look forward to continuing it in future.